There is a question that sat unanswered in the records of the Harwick County Agricultural Extension Office for 11 years, filed in a folder so thin it might have been an accident. The question was this: why did one small operation root vegetable grower, working fewer than 90 acres of marginal bottomland with second-hand equipment and no formal training beyond an 8th grade certificate, consistently deliver table-grade beets in years when every surrounding grower, including the 3 largest contract farms serviced by the Delmarva Consolidated Cannery, reported catastrophic split root losses averaging between 18 and 52 tons per season? The extension agent who finally opened that folder in the autumn of the 11th year wrote in his margin notes, with what one imagines was a pen held slightly too tight, she was not lucky. She had a system. Nobody asked her what it was. Her name was Vera Polk, and she had been born in that house, which is the first thing you need to know about her, because people who are born in a house understand it differently than people who purchase one. She knew where the frost came in under the east sill. She knew the particular smell of the back field after a week of dry August heat, a smell like old iron and something sweeter underneath, like the earth was trying to tell you it was thirsty before the thirsty became desperate. She had learned to read that smell from her grandmother, who had in turn learned it from her own mother, and who had written down a great many things she had learned in a series of composition notebooks that lived in a wooden box under the washstand in the back bedroom, and that Vera consulted the way other people consulted the almanac or the priest. She began reading the notebooks after her grandmother died, when Vera was 31 and had just taken over the farm alone. And the first thing she found written on the first page of the oldest notebook, in a script so cramped it took 3 readings to parse, was this: "Water does not forgive what the ground cannot hold." That sentence would come to mean a great many things to a great many people, but at the time it meant nothing to anyone except Vera, who folded a piece of paper into the page and went back to it over and over across the next decade, turning it in her mind the way you turn a stone to find what lives under it. The region around Harwick County had been beet country since before the first canning facility was established in 1947. The soil was river-deposited silt over clay, which was excellent for beets in wet years and merciless in dry ones, because clay held surface moisture just long enough to fool a plant into setting deep and then cracked, and the crack ran right through whatever was growing in it. The crack was the enemy. It was the reason for the split roots. It was the reason the cannery wrote off tonnage every fall with the bored efficiency of an accountant who has long since stopped being surprised by a recurring line item. Between 1971 and 1981, the 3 largest contract farms in the county, the Belcher operation, the Stannard brothers, and a corporate holding called Ridgeline Produce Incorporated, that had bought out 2 family farms and consolidated their acreage into a single managed block, collectively reported split root losses that the Extension Office later calculated at slightly over 430 tons across the decade. The cannery absorbed those losses through a contract clause that allowed them to reduce per-ton payment in high-loss years and recoup through volume in good ones. The growers called this arrangement a partnership. The cannery called it standard practice. The clause was written in language that favored the cannery in 12 of the 14 contingency scenarios, which is the kind of thing you only discover after you have already signed. Vera had not signed the consolidated contract. She had maintained an older, smaller, individual grower agreement that had been in place since her grandmother's time, which paid a fixed per-ton rate for table-grade root and made no provisions for cannery-side loss absorption because it predated the concept. The Delmarva Consolidated representative, a man named Galen Pruitt, who drove a company truck and wore a company jacket with his name embroidered above the left pocket, had visited Vera twice in 1972 to encourage her to move to the consolidated agreement. He was not unkind about it. He brought a printed summary sheet with 2 columns of numbers, one labeled Current Terms and one labeled Proposed Terms, and the proposed column was in every superficial way more generous. Higher ceiling price, access to company-subsidized fertilizer purchasing, priority scheduling at the weighing station. He sat at her kitchen table and explained it carefully, as though careful explanation were itself a form of generosity. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "What happens to the per-ton rate in a loss year?" He showed her the clause. She read it twice. She said, "So in a loss year, the rate drops to the company's discretion." He said that was not exactly how he would characterize it and began to explain the language of the clause, which was considerable. She said she needed to think about it. He left the summary sheet on the table. She put it in the wooden box under the washstand next to the notebooks, which is where things went that needed to be remembered as evidence. She had a system. It had taken her 3 years of reading the notebooks, 2 years of failing at a version of it that was incomplete, and one catastrophic spring in which she lost a third of her seedling stock before she understood what the oldest notebook was actually describing. The notebook was not a diary. It was a technical record. Her great-grandmother, who had come to this land when it was rawer and poorer than anyone living would recognize, had been conducting what amounted to an informal multi-decade experiment in subsoil moisture management, documented in the prose of someone who had no scientific vocabulary, but an extremely precise observational mind. The entries did not use the word capillary. They described what capillary action does, in sentences like, "Pack the channel tight with river grit to the second knuckle depth. The water came up through it slow and stayed." They did not use the word compaction. They noted, "Where the mule turned at the row end, the ground went hard, and the beets there split every time. Moved the turning place to the grass lane." What the notebooks described, assembled across their full sequence and read as a system rather than a collection of observations, was a method of subsoil channel preparation that distributed moisture from a low point in the field upward through the root zone at a rate slow enough to prevent the sudden saturation events that caused clay soils to crack when they dried. The channels were not irrigation in any formal sense. They were more like a deliberate shaping of the ground's own tendency, coaxing the field to hold water the way a cupped hand holds it evenly, without pooling. They had to be prepared in early spring, before planting by hand, using a narrow implement that Vera's great-grandmother had called the tooth, which turned out to be a modified cultivating tine she had bent to a specific angle over a forge that was no longer on the property. Vera had to have one made by a retired implement dealer in the next county over, describing the angle from a drawing in the notebook to a man who looked at the drawing for a long time and then said, "Huh," and made it without further comment. The work was extraordinary. It was not the kind of work that looked like anything from the road. A person driving past Vera's fields in March would have seen a woman walking slow rows behind a single-horse cultivator in weather that nobody with options would have chosen to be outside in, moving at a pace that suggested either deep thought or mild confusion. The rows she walked produced no visible result. The ground looked, when she was finished, exactly like ground that had not been walked. The channels were 6 inches down and half an inch wide, and spaced according to a table in the second notebook that correlated spacing to the clay content of the soil, which Vera estimated by a feel and settle test her grandmother had described as putting the earth to the question. She had done this for 9 springs in a row. Each spring, she refined the spacing slightly based on the previous fall's results, which she recorded in a notebook of her own in a hand that was neater than her great-grandmother's but carried the same precision. Galen Pruitt drove past her fields on a March morning in 1975 and stopped his truck. He had heard from the Belcher farm manager that Vera was doing something unusual with her ground preparation, and the Belcher manager had mentioned it in the tone of voice that people use when they mean to say unusual and want you to understand they mean to say foolish. Pruitt got out of the truck and walked to the fence and watched her for a while. She did not wave. He called out to ask what she was doing. She said she was working the ground. He asked what for. She said, "For the crop." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are deciding how to be kind, and told her that the company's agronomist had recently recommended a new subsoiling program using a commercial ripper attachment that went 18 inches deep and broke the hardpan in a single efficient pass. He said most of the contract growers were going to that method this season. He said he could probably arrange access to the company's ripper rig at cost if she wanted to try it. She said, "How wide is the disruption after the ripper passes?" He said about 14 inches. She said, "And then what?" He said the agronomist recommended a light press roll to close the surface. She turned back to her horse and said nothing else. He stood at the fence another minute, then got back in his truck. The Belcher farm ripped its ground that spring. So did the Stannard brothers. Ridgeline Produce Incorporated ripped all of its acreage in a single week using 2 contracted machines and posted a progress photograph in the Harwick County Farmers Bulletin, which was the kind of thing only an operation with a publicity budget thought to do. The photo showed wide, clean furrows and 2 men in company caps looking satisfied. The caption said, "Modern ground preparation for maximum yield potential." Vera's neighbor to the north, a retired schoolteacher named Odell Marsh, who kept 3 goats and an extensive kitchen garden and had no agricultural stake in anyone's decisions, brought the bulletin over one afternoon and set it on Vera's porch rail without saying anything for a moment. Then he said he supposed she had seen the picture. She said she had. He said he didn't know much about beet farming, but that ripping sounded like it would save a person a lot of walking in the cold. She said it would. He asked if she was going to try it. She looked at him for a moment and said, "Water does not forgive what the ground cannot hold." He thought about that. He said he wasn't sure he understood her. She said, "Good evening, Odell," and went inside. He stood on the porch holding the bulletin for another moment and then left. The result of the 1975 harvest was not immediately decisive. It was a moderately wet year, which meant the ripper-prepared ground performed adequately, because moderate wet years do not produce the conditions that expose the difference between a field that merely drains and a field that breathes. The Belcher operation reported good numbers. Ridgeline's acreage came in ahead of projection. The Stannard brothers sent a postcard to the extension office noting their lowest split root percentage since 1968. Vera's numbers were, as they had been since 1969, the best in the county at table grade percentage, but the margin was not dramatic enough to attract comment. It was the kind of difference that looks like luck. The extension office noted it. Nobody discussed it. The years between 1975 and 1979 were the long, invisible middle, and they were not dramatic from the outside. What they were, on the inside of Vera's operation, was an accumulation. Each year, the channels were re-walked and refined. Each year, the notebook entry for that spring was compared against the notebook entry for the spring before. Each year, the field's behavior in wet weeks and dry weeks was logged against the previous year's log, and small adjustments were made, a fraction of an inch in channel spacing in the southeast quadrant where the clay ran heavier, a change in the timing of the first pass relative to soil temperature, a note that the horse needed to walk slightly wider of the channel line than originally thought, because the hoof pressure at the verge was affecting moisture lateral movement in a way the notebooks had anticipated, but that Vera had initially discounted. She had, by 1978, walked those rows enough times that she could close her eyes and feel through the handles of the cultivating rig the precise difference between ground that was ready and ground that needed another week. That knowledge lived in her hands. There is no other place it could live. The Stannard brothers, meanwhile, had deepened their ripping program. They had purchased their own ripper rig in 1976, financed through the company's equipment subsidy program, which had a repayment structure tied to their annual contract payment, which was in turn subject to the loss year adjustment clause, which nobody had thought through to the end of the chain. Ridgeline Produce Incorporated had installed a center pivot irrigation system on its main block, which was efficient in the sense that it delivered water precisely, but which delivered it in a way that the clay subsoil, having been disrupted and then surface pressed and then not given adequate time to reconsolidate around its new structure, could not distribute laterally. The water moved down, not out. In a dry summer, it found the disrupted channel lines and migrated away from the root zone before the roots could use it. In a wet summer, it pooled. Neither condition was visible at the surface until it was too late to correct in the current season. Vera had noticed this. She had written it down. She had noted in her 1977 log a specific observation about the Stannard fields visible from her east fence line, which she phrased as follows: Their ground is working against itself. She had also written, 2 lines below that observation, the same sentence her great-grandmother had written in 1931 after a hard spring. The ones who move fastest through the ground always find the wall first. In the spring of 1979, a woman named Cressida Vane arrived at Vera's farm. She was 26 years old and had come from the State Agricultural College with a graduate thesis topic she described, standing in Vera's doorway with a canvas bag over one shoulder, as the persistence of pre-mechanization soil management practices in small acreage root vegetable cultivation, which was a long way to say she was interested in old methods that still worked. She had found Vera's operation through the Extension Office's yield records, which she had pulled and graphed and then looked at for a long time, trying to understand the shape of what she was seeing, which was a line that did not behave the way any of the lines around it behaved. She had asked the extension agent about it. He had said, honestly, he had no idea. She had driven 3 hours. Vera looked at her in the doorway for a moment. She said, "Can you walk rows in cold mud?" Cressida said she could. Vera said, "Come back tomorrow morning." Cressida did. They did not talk much that first week because the work did not leave much room for talking and because Vera was not a person who talked while she worked. What happened was that Cressida watched, and after 3 days, she began to understand the geometry of what she was watching. And on the 4th day, she asked a specific question about channel spacing in relation to root depth at the point of maximum moisture demand. Vera stopped the horse. She looked at Cressida. She said, "You read soil physics." Cressida said a little. Vera said, "Come inside." She got out the notebooks. Cressida sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours without moving, reading. When she looked up, she said, she worked this out herself. Vera said she worked it out from what the field showed her. Cressida said that was the same thing. Vera said, yes. Cressida stayed through that spring and came back in the fall and stayed through the harvest and wrote letters during the winter. She had the angle of the tooth verified by a soil physics professor at the college who spent a week visiting the farm the following spring, and who said, in his published note in an obscure agronomic journal that was read by perhaps 200 people, that the implement and method combination appeared to produce what he termed a passive capillary redistribution zone in soils of moderate to high clay content, and that the effect of this zone on root zone moisture stability during fluctuating surface conditions was, and this is a quote, remarkable and underreported. He sent Vera a copy of the journal. She put it in the wooden box. What nobody outside the farm knew in the spring of 1980 was that the weather pattern establishing itself across the mid-Atlantic region that year was one that the National Weather Service would later describe as a compound event. A wet spring followed by an abrupt transition to a dry summer with a single high rainfall event in August. This pattern, which occurs in the region on average once every 11 to 15 years, is the specific pattern most damaging to clay subsoil beet cultivation because the wet spring drives deep root set. The dry summer creates surface crack, and the August rain, arriving fast and hard on cracked ground, saturates the surface before it can penetrate evenly, creating the pressure differential that splits roots already under drought stress. It is, in a phrase, the worst possible sequence in the worst possible order. It had happened in 1934, which was documented in the notebooks. It had happened in 1957, which Vera remembered because she had been 11 and her grandmother had been strangely calm about it, the way a person is calm when they have prepared for the thing that everyone else is afraid of. In June of 1980, Vera read the sky and the soil the way the notebooks had taught her to read them and wrote in her own log, pattern of 34. She walked the channels one more time. She adjusted the surface cover on the beds. She told Cressida, who had come back that season, what she expected in August. Cressida asked how certain she was. Vera said, certain enough. She went back to work. Galen Pruitt drove past the farm in July and stopped, as he sometimes still did. He said the season was looking good. He said Ridgeline's mid-season count was ahead of previous years. He said the Stannard brothers had taken on a second irrigation contract. He was still using the word good when Vera said, how much of their ground is surface irrigated versus subsoil supplied? He paused. He said, "Surface, mostly, I expect." She said, in a fast August rain, "How fast does the pivot water penetrate a dry, cracked surface?" He looked at her. She said she was asking a real question. He said he supposed it would depend. She said, "Yes, it would." She said, "Good evening, Mr. Pruitt." He got back in his truck. On the 12th of August, 1980, a storm system that had been building over the Chesapeake for 4 days came ashore and dropped 4.5 inches of rain on Harwick County in 18 hours. It came on ground that had not had significant rain since the second week of June. The soil on the large format farms, ripped and packed and pivot-watered in a pattern that had kept the surface zone alive but had never reconciled the disrupted subsoil structure to its new arrangement, received the rain the way a stopped drain receives water. At the surface, in volume, with nowhere to go. The crack lines on the Belcher fields, which a Belcher hand had photographed casually in late July because they were dramatic-looking and he thought someone might want a record of how dry it had gotten, became entry channels for water that moved down fast and then laterally through the disrupted ripper lines and reached the root zones in a wave. The Stannard Brothers fields, which were somewhat better drained owing to a slight grade, fared slightly better, which in this context meant approximately the same. Ridgeline's main block, the showpiece operation with the center pivot and the progress photographs, took the rain on surface-sealed clay that the pivot had watered in a pattern precisely calculated for the conditions that had existed before August 12th, and which was therefore calculated incorrectly for the conditions that existed on August 12th and for the 2 weeks following. Vera's fields took the rain and held it. The channels distributed it at the rate they had been designed to distribute moisture, which was not as fast as the rain fell but faster than the root zone could saturate, which meant the pressure built slowly and was absorbed slowly and never created the differential that splits a root. The surface did not crack in July because the channel system had been supplying the root zone laterally through the dry period, which meant the surface zone had never fully desiccated, which meant it received the August rain on ground that was already at depth in a condition of equilibrium. The Beets did not split, not one bed. Vera walked the rows on the morning of the 13th in the aftermath, with the sky still gray and the air smelling of wet iron and the deeper sweetness underneath, and she counted. She walked every row. It took most of the morning. When she came in, she wrote in her log, "Clean." She sat at the table for a while, then she put on the kettle. Cressida arrived that afternoon in a truck she had borrowed, having driven the perimeter of the Belcher fields and pulled off at the Stannard access road and seen enough to understand the scale of what was happening. She stood in Vera's kitchen doorway with her coat still on and said, "They lost almost everything." Vera said, "I know." Cressida said, "Your fields are fine." Vera said, "I know." Cressida looked at her and said, "How are you feeling?" Vera said, "Tired." Cressida sat down at the table. Neither of them said anything for a while. Vera poured 2 cups of tea and they drank them, and outside the gray sky was going darker and the smell of the wet ground came through the window screen. And it was, Cressida would write later, not a triumphant smell at all. It was the smell of something that had been true for a long time, finally being visible to the people who had not wanted to see it. Vera got up and washed the cups and said she needed to check the north bed before dark. She went out. Cressida sat there for another moment, and then she went out too. Galen Pruitt came to the farm on the 17th of August. He came without the company truck, which was notable because in 9 years of visiting he had always come in the company truck. He came in a personal vehicle, a dark green station wagon, and he parked it on the road and came through the gate on foot and took his cap off when he got to the porch. Vera was sitting on the porch steps going over the notebook. She looked up. He stood there with his cap in both hands, which was the posture of a man who had prepared something to say and had decided, on arriving, that what he had prepared was wrong. He said, "My numbers aren't final, but it looks like Belcher is down to about 12 deliverable tons out of 68. Ridgeline might come in at 15% of projection. The Stanards I don't know yet, but their east block is a write-off." She said nothing. He said, "Your count." She said, "Clean." He said, "All of it." She said, "All of it." He stood there. He put his cap back on and then took it off again. He said, "I owe you an explanation." She said, "No." He said, "I owe you something." She said, "I don't need anything from the company right now." He said, "I mean personally." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Sit down if you want to." He sat down on the top step at a distance, and they were both quiet for a while, and the late summer field smell came up from the ground below them. And after a time he said, "How did you know?" She said, "My great-grandmother knew." He thought about that. He said, "Where did she learn it?" Vera said, "From the field." He nodded slowly. He said, "I've been in agricultural sales for 19 years, and nobody ever showed me that." She said, "Nobody showed me either." She picked up the notebook and held it for a moment and set it back on her knee. She said, "The field shows you if you watch it long enough." He said, "I'm sorry we didn't listen." She said, "Yes." That was all. After a while, he said he should be going. She said she had work to do. He walked back to the station wagon and she went back to the notebook. What happened in the weeks after the storm was not a negotiation so much as a slow gravitational shift. The cannery, facing a delivery shortfall that its contracts had not adequately predicted because the loss year clause had always previously been invoked for losses in the 20 to 40% range and had never contemplated a season in which 2 of 3 major suppliers were delivering below 20% of projection, needed Beets. They needed them badly enough that the arithmetic of the fixed-rate individual contract, the old one, the one that paid a straightforward per-ton rate for table-grade root without adjustment clauses, suddenly looked very different than it had looked to Galen Pruitt in 1972 when he had sat at Vera's kitchen table with his 2-column summary sheet. Vera had approximately 91 deliverable tons. The cannery wanted all of them. She said she would deliver them at the existing contract rate, which had not been renegotiated upward in 11 years and which was, by 1980, considerably below prevailing market price. The cannery's contract manager said they would of course compensate her at whatever rate she felt was fair given the circumstances. She said the existing rate was fair. She said she had been delivering at that rate for 11 years, and she intended to deliver at it now. The contract manager said he wasn't sure he understood. She said, "I have a price, and you know it, and it hasn't changed." That was the end of the negotiation. She delivered the 91 tons at the old rate. The cannery, with some embarrassment, paid it. The difference between what she charged and what the market would have borne that season, given the regional shortage, was later estimated by Cressida, who had access to the pricing data for her thesis, at somewhere between $11,000 and $17,000, which in 1980 was not a small sum. Odell Marsh, when Cressida told him this over the fence one afternoon, said that was a foolish thing to do. Cressida said she thought it was the opposite. He thought about it and said, "Maybe." He went back to his goats. What Vera did with the price differential was more complicated than leaving money on the table, because she did not simply decline the money and go home. She used the delivery transaction and the access to the cannery's facilities and scheduling that came with being the region's primary functional supplier that fall to negotiate something she had been thinking about for 3 years. An informal cooperative inspection arrangement by which small acreage growers who adopted the channel preparation method and achieved a measurable reduction in split root losses would be given priority scheduling at the weighing station and a guaranteed floor price for table-grade root that was higher than the consolidated contract offered in bad years but lower than spot market in good ones, which is to say, it was a stable price. And stability in agricultural contracting is worth more than any single season's premium. She wrote up the terms herself. They fit on one page. She submitted them to the cannery's operations office and told the operations manager, a pragmatic woman named Cheryl Ott, who had been watching the whole season with the focused attention of someone whose job it was to ensure that a cannery had beets to process, that she could take it or leave it. Cheryl Ott read the one page. She said, "This benefits the small growers considerably." Vera said, "Yes." Cheryl said, It also benefits us. Vera said, yes, that's why I wrote it that way. There was one condition. Growers who joined the arrangement had to learn the preparation method, not a pamphlet, not a field day. Vera would walk rows with each grower personally for as many mornings as it took until the grower could feel the difference between prepared ground and unprepared ground through the handles of the implement. This condition was not negotiable. 3 growers came the first spring. One of them was Harold Stannard, the younger of the Stannard brothers, who arrived on a March morning in 1981, looking as though being there cost him something considerable. He took his gloves off and put them back on 3 times before he spoke. He said he supposed she knew why he was there. She said she supposed she did. He said he wasn't sure he was the right person to be learning from someone he had treated the way he had treated her, which was the most he ever said about it, and which was enough. She handed him a pair of working gloves that were not his and said to follow the horse. He followed the horse. At the end of the morning, after 2 hours of walking the rows in silence with cold coming up through the wet ground, he said, I think I felt it. She said, not yet. He came back the next morning. She said, now you felt it. Cressida Vane submitted her thesis in the spring of 1982. It ran to 211 pages and included a full transcription of the notebooks, annotated against published soil physics literature, and a field data section that comprised Vera's own logs from 1969 to 1981, cross-referenced with Extension Office yield records and cannery delivery manifests. The thesis committee described it as exceptionally documented. One committee member, a senior professor of agronomy who had been in the field for 30 years, said it was the most detailed account of empirically derived vernacular soil management he had encountered in the published or unpublished literature. He asked where the original notebooks were. Cressida said they were in a wooden box under a washstand on a farm in Harwick County. He asked if they could be donated to the university archive. She said she would ask. Vera said no. She said they were working notebooks, not museum pieces, and that they still had work to do in them. She said when they were done she would think about it. They did have work to do. The cooperative arrangement grew in the years after 1980, slowly and without spectacle, because the method was not fast to learn, and Vera would not permit it to be abbreviated. By 1985, there were 11 growers in the arrangement. By 1989, there were 19. Each one had walked rows with Vera in cold mud until they could feel what they were doing, and each one had been told to keep a log, and each one's log was reviewed by Vera at the end of the season against their yield data, and the correction for the following spring was worked out between them, in plain language, at the kitchen table or at the field edge, wherever there was light enough to read. The Extension Office, which had been embarrassed by the 1980 season in ways that were not publicly articulated but were internally quite vivid, sent a new agent in 1983 who asked Vera if she would be willing to present her method at the County Agricultural Forum. She said she would present it to people who were going to use it. She said she would not present it to people who were going to take notes and file them. The agent, who was young enough to find this answer clarifying rather than offensive, said he thought he could arrange for people who would use it. She said, then yes. The forum was not a spectacle. It was a morning in a feed store meeting room with folding chairs and bad coffee and 12 people who had agreed to walk rows the following week. Vera spoke for 20 minutes. She used no slides. She had brought one of the intermediate notebooks, not the oldest, but one from the 1940s that had particularly clear description of the channel geometry, and she read 4 passages from it, slowly, and then she said, this is what we will do Monday morning, and if you cannot feel what I am describing by Wednesday, you need to come back a 3rd time, and I will be there. She walked out before anyone could ask a question. The agent who had arranged the forum later said it was the best agricultural presentation he had attended in his career, which was a generous characterization of something that by any conventional standard had been notably abrupt. Vera was 63 in 1989, and her hands had begun to show the weather of 40 seasons in them. She still walked rows in March, but she walked them more slowly, and Cressida, who had by then completed a 2nd degree and was teaching at the State College, came home to the farm most springs to walk with her. The wooden box had 2 additional notebooks in it now, the log Vera had been keeping since 1969, and a separate volume that Cressida had compiled from the field data and annotated with published references, which lived in the box as a bridge between the old language and the new one. The tooth was still in use. The original tooth that Vera had had made from the drawing in the notebook had been used until the tine bent beyond recalibration, at which point it had been measured precisely and copied, and the copy had been copied again, and the angle and dimensions were now written in the front of Cressida's compiled volume in a notation that was simultaneously in the old units the notebooks used and the metric units that the college required, so that no version of the knowledge was locked inside the other. Odell Marsh died in 1986, which Vera noted in her log that fall in the same way she noted crop results and weather anomalies, with precision and without excess. She wrote, Odell Marsh, neighbor Northfield, died September. Honest man, asked good questions late. She did not write more than that. She did not need to. He had, in his last years, become one of the people who walked the field edge with her in the evenings, not working, just walking, listening to her read passages from the notebooks sometimes, understanding maybe a third of it, but listening the way some people listen to music they cannot play. He had told her, the last autumn he was well enough to walk, that he thought she was the most stubborn person he had ever met, and that he meant it as the highest compliment he had. She had said he was probably right on both counts. He had laughed. It was the last time she heard him laugh, and she was glad the last time had been outdoor air and field smell and a joke that was also true. The cannery was sold in 1991 to a larger regional processing company headquartered in 2 states and operating in 5, which is the trajectory of most canneries in that era, the inevitable arithmetic of consolidation. The new ownership reviewed the cooperative arrangement's terms and found them, according to their own analysis, mildly favorable to the growers and mildly unfavorable to the cannery, which is exactly what Vera had intended, and which the new ownership, having inherited a reliable small acreage supplier network that had delivered consistent table-grade volume through 2 subsequent difficult weather years without significant loss, decided to honor because the alternative was renegotiating with 19 separate growers at once, which no one in the corporate office had time for. Cheryl Ott, who had been with the operation through the ownership change and who was the only person in the building who understood the full history of how the arrangement had come to exist, put a note in the new ownership's file that said simply, "Do not adjust this contract." They did not. Vera stopped walking rows herself in 1993. She was 67, and her knees had made a decision that she respected without approving of it. She still walked the fields, but the implement was handled by Cressida in the springs Cressida could come, and by a young man named Thomas, who had joined the arrangement in 1990 as one of 19 growers and who had, by common unspoken acknowledgement, developed the best hand of anyone except Vera herself for feeling the ground through the handles. He did not talk much. Vera had said this was the right trait for the work, and nobody had disagreed. He came every March. He walked the rows. He kept his log. He brought it to Vera in the evenings, and they went over it at the table, and she told him what she saw in it, and he listened and wrote corrections in the margin in his own handwriting and took it home. He had started keeping his own notebooks. He had bought composition notebooks from the same brand she used, which was not a coincidence. In the fall of 1995, the Extension Office of Harwick County, under pressure from the state's Small Farm Preservation Program, commissioned a retrospective analysis of agricultural performance in the county across the preceding 25 years. The analysis was conducted by a graduate student in agricultural economics who had no prior knowledge of the Polk farm and who approached the yield data as a clean statistical exercise. The analysis was completed in 4 months and submitted to the Extension Office and the State Program Office and filed in a binder that was more substantial than the original thin folder. The graduate student's finding, stated in the executive summary in language that was careful and precise and slightly astonished, was as follows. A single small acreage operation, employing a documented vernacular soil management system, demonstrated yield stability across all weather years in the study period that exceeded that of all larger operations in the county by a statistically significant margin, and sustained zero split root loss in the two worst weather years of the period, while county-wide average split root loss in those years exceeded 40% of total planted acreage. The finding continued. The system has since been adopted by 19 operations in the county cooperative arrangement and has produced measurable loss reduction in all adopting operations within 2 seasons of adoption. The finding concluded. This method appears to have been in practice on the originating farm for at minimum 60 years prior to formal documentation, and the full duration of its development is unknown. Unknown, the graduate student had written, because she had read the notebooks by that point, and she knew that the honest answer to how long this knowledge had been accumulating was longer than the records we have. Vera read the executive summary when Cressida brought it to the farm. She read it once. She set it on the table. She said, "They got most of it right." Cressida asked what they got wrong. Vera said, "They said my great-grandmother developed it." She said my great-grandmother wrote down what the field had already been doing. She said the field developed it. Cressida wrote that down. She had long since learned to write down the things Vera said in that tone of voice, which was not a tone of wisdom performance, but a tone of reporting. The same tone the notebooks had always used, factual, flat, precise, arrived at through observation and not through opinion. Vera died in the winter of 2001 at 75 in the house she had been born in the back bedroom, with the wooden box on the table beside her where Cressida had put it when it became clear that the end was close. She had asked for it to be there not for sentiment, but because there was an entry she wanted to finish, a note about the previous fall's channel performance on the north bed that she had started and not completed. She finished it. It was 3 sentences. The last one was spacing holds. She closed the notebook and put it in the box, and that was the last thing she wrote. The wooden box is in the university archive now, which is what Vera had said she would think about, and she must have thought about it because she left instructions for it to go there after she was done with it, and she was precise about what done meant, after the knowledge in it had been taught forward enough times that the box was a record rather than a tool. Cressida judged that threshold to have been crossed around 2003, when the 41st grower in the expanded cooperative arrangement completed their 2nd season of log keeping, and the channel preparation method was being taught in the State Agricultural College's extension curriculum, not as historical curiosity, but as current practice. She delivered the box to the archive herself. The archivist asked what label to put on it. Cressida said, "Call it what it is. Working Notebooks, Harwick County, ongoing." The archive catalog entry is 240 words long. At the end of it, the cataloging archivist, who had read enough of the notebooks to know they deserved more than standard description, added a line that was not strictly part of the catalog format. She wrote it in the notes field, which is where archivists put the things they could not leave out. The line is, "These books record the only form of knowledge the field could never write down for itself, which is the knowledge of someone who stayed long enough to listen." That is the sentence that lives at the end of this story. It was not written by Vera. It did not need to be. She had already written everything necessary, in notebooks that were working notebooks and not museum pieces, in a hand that was neat and precise and that smelled, if you held the pages close, still faintly of wet March ground and something underneath it, something older, something the earth had been keeping until someone finally learned to ask.